Hello, my dear friend. According to a recent study, 65% of parents report experiencing burnout. Are you part of this statistic? I'm going to explain more details about this study. And today we're going to have a special guest that's going to help you if you can relate to this and feel that you are struggling to kind of keep up with balancing work and life, if that is even possible. We're going to be giving you tons of tips. So I hope that your notebook is out for today's episode. And halfway through the episode, I'm going to give you a reflection prompt and some of my insights in terms of what we spoke about so far. And at the end of this study, right at the end of this episode, I'll explain the study that I just highlighted and give you some tips from science so that you have everything together, the science, the tools, and hopefully you feel validated and seen by this episode. Welcome to the Reflective Parenting Podcast. My name is Cindy Hovington and I'm your host. I'm a mom of three from Montreal, Canada, and I have a Ph.D. in neuroscience. My goal through this podcast is to share the work that we are doing, our small team here at Curious Neuron. We are working really hard to make sure that we can support parents. This is not parenting advice. Don't worry, you're not getting that kind of advice. But what this podcast is all about, and Curious Neuron, which is the company that I am the founder of, we are trying to help parents feel seen and validated. And most importantly, we are helping you build some skills. Now, these are not parenting skills, but they are skills that, according to research, will help you parent your child better. These are emotion regulation skills and emotional intelligence. And so if you'd like to read some of our blogs, there's a blog associated with today's episode. You can read it at curiousneuron.com or click the link in the show notes. There are going to be some social media posts focused on this episode as well. And so you can join us there at Instagram at curious_neuron or on Facebook. And lastly, if you want to really dive deep, if this is an episode that resonates with you and you're like, I need to really reflect on how to work on this, I don't know where to begin. This podcast episode, as all our episodes, are the educational piece. But now we need to practice. We need to hold ourselves accountable to see the change and to make the work or start the work and make it happen. And so that is why we have the Reflective Parent Club. This is not your typical parenting membership. This is a 3-month program that not only are you kind of working through the course and the science of helping you regulate your emotions, but you're getting the support 1 hour every week where you can join me and other parents and do the work. So we're going to be talking about that halfway through the episode. I first also want to thank the Tannenbaum Open Science Institute for supporting this podcast, as well as the McConnell Foundation. Both of these organizations believe in the importance of sharing science. Curious Neuron is all based in science. And so I'm very grateful that we have the support of these organizations. I'm also very grateful for you. Thank you for supporting the Curious Neuron. Now it's called the Reflective Parenting Podcast. And as you can tell, I'm still used to calling it that. But this podcast would not be here without you. And so thank you. Make sure that you click on that button to subscribe, whether you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, or if you are watching on YouTube, take a second, click the subscribe button. That way you'll know when there's a next episode. Next episode is the Father's Day weekend. So we're covering research around dads. So I hope that you click on subscribe. And then after that, we have this summer, we're going to talk about music and how that helps you. We're going to talk about validation and how important validation is for yourself, for your own self-compassion, for the relationship you have with your partner and with your kids. What else do we have going on? We're going to talk about teen boys and mental health. So make sure you subscribe. All right. So my guest today is somebody that I had the absolute pleasure of listening to give a keynote talk at an event that I attended in Abu Dhabi. I was one of the speakers as well. Her name is Daisy Dowling. And not only is she an author, the author of Work Parent, the link is in the show notes, but she is also a HBR columnist. So that is a Harvard Business Review columnist. She is an executive coach. She is a Columbia Business School professor and a working parenthood expert. I mean, to say that it's an honor for us to have her on the podcast is really underestimating. It is huge. I was just so happy that she said she would join us. And you're going to see, because just like all of these really big names, people that are doing these kinds of executive coaching, I used to bring in more researchers, but I find that not doing that anymore, but I find that these executive coaches just have so many tips and tools for us. And that is one of those episodes. I am telling you that I listened to the episode twice before publishing it now, so that I can take my own notes. And so you're going to see that my notes are also in the blog, and you're going to see them on Instagram this week. And we're going to talk about it inside the Reflective Parent Club. Anyways, I don't want to make you wait any longer. Please enjoy my conversation with Daisy Dowling. Hi, everyone. And as promised, I'm here with Daisy Dowling. Daisy, welcome to the Reflective Parenting Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
I am really looking forward to this conversation. First, you and I had the opportunity to meet very far away from where we are right now, but in Abu Dhabi, where I heard you talk and realized, wow, everybody needs to hear this. Everybody needs to hear about your book, Work Parent. And I've heard bits and pieces of like the fact that the book came from a need that you had. So we're going to get into that. But most importantly, we're going to talk about some advice from your book and from your work for parents the parents that I speak with, it's a really big struggle in terms of trying to figure out whether or not this work-life balance exists. Is it a myth? Is it true?
Yeah.
But we'll definitely get into that. So first, I'd love to understand what led you to the work that you are doing now, specifically with working parents.
Yeah. So I feel like I should have a glamour story here. And the real story is one of need.
Mm,
So for many years, I had built a career that I absolutely loved as an executive coach. And I was working inside some large, successful corporations. And I realized, though, that all of the advice I could give people about how to get ahead and get promoted or have a great meeting with their boss or give a good presentation, that was useful to them. But then they would come to me with questions about, well, you've told me about time management, but now I have a 6-month-old at home. And how do I manage my time when I have to get down to the daycare at 6 p.m. every day?
mm,
And I had no advice for them on that. And you can see where this is going, right? Spoiler alert. I became a parent myself in 2012. And I realized that I didn't have these answers either. I was on
right.
parental leave, and I thought to myself, how do I tell my boss's boss that I'm coming back from leave and I still am interested in promotion? How do I set up my daily schedule? How do I make sure that I have really wonderful connective time with my daughter while doing well at work? And there was nothing out there. I
Mm,
actually went down to a major bookstore here in New York City, and I said to the very nice clerk, like, where's the working parent book? Right? Because
mm,
there's a book on everything.
mm-hmm,
And he said, well, there's the parenting section. And he pointed to one side of the bookstore. And he said, and there's the career section. And he pointed to the other side of the bookstore. And there was nothing in between. So, very long story short, I just began asking other working parents who seemed to kind of have it together. And I said, what's your advice? What are your tricks? What are your hacks? How do you make this work?
mm,
And I realized there was no single source of support for people who wanted to combine career and caregiving and love and work, right?
mm,
But there was so much wisdom and lived experience. And if we gathered all that into one unit, into like one place people could go, and I'm a writer, so I thought about a book, that it could be so valuable. So I basically
mm.
wrote the book that I desperately needed to read. That's the way I came to it.
And that's the kind of feeling, like I think like when you finish the book, you say like, yes, this is possible, right? Like you get this feeling of like, yes, it is possible to kind of, I'm going to use the word balance, but we're going to get into that, kind of get everything together. You kind of walk us through like the first steps when you're expecting, when you're going back to work. And I think that it gives us this blueprint to say, here's how we can go about it. And here's the guide, which I truly appreciate. What would, if a parent is listening to this and saying, let's start off with that word. I just can't balance everything. There's always something that is out of control. It could be my home. It could be the feeling of being a parent and my kids are just like out of control. I'm going through a phase with them. It could be my relationship at the moment, or it could be work. I'm behind. I haven't kept up with the work I'm supposed to do. Something always feels out of control. And I think that's why we always say, like, I don't have good work-life balance. Where do we begin
Yeah.
that conversation?
So what I do with my coaching clients who bring this topic up, which everybody does,
Yeah.
um, I always challenge them about what they mean by balance.
Mm-hmm.
Because when we say work-life balance or life balance, we imagine that every single day is this perfect sort of equilibrium between caregiving and professional responsibilities and other things that we have going on in our lives.
Mm,
And I don't know that that particular image of balance is really going to be realistic or serves us.
right.
What I hear successful, satisfied working parents who have been doing this for years and who've developed some confidence say all the time is that it's about going long on one part of your life and then correcting in a very deliberate and intentional way to
Hmm.
cover off the other. So let's say, for example, you and I met when we were both on a business trip, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have two young kids at home. That week was not my good parenting week,
Not
right?
same, right?
I was jet lagged and cranky and,
Yeah.
thousands of miles away, right? So I was into work, but I was away from parenting. But I made very certain when I got home that I was going to take that next day and a half off
Mm-hmm.
or really do minimal work, do pickup from school, which I might not always do, cook for the kids, spend time with them, host a play date for my younger daughter,
Mm.
whatever, so that I was overcorrecting back. And so at any given time, it's okay to feel really unbalanced, but it's about managing towards a totality as opposed to thinking about having everything be like a straight line all the time.
Right. And I love that visual you just gave, that straight line, because I see it more as waves, right? Like we could be, or I don't know, there's another visual to it, but that's the way I see it, where I can see my calendar and say, okay, April is going to be tough. The end of April is going to be tough. I have a lot going on, but then I'm going to compensate for that before it or after it. And I think when we look at it from that broader perspective, as you just said, we do feel a bit more of that sense of control, because I think that's what parents feel like. You just lose control of everything, right? And then you've
Yeah.
gained it. Yeah.
There's another really important thing going on here too, I think, which is that all of us have gotten to a certain place professionally because we're really, really good at being on top of the details and totally zipped up and, working until 10 o'clock at night if we need to and going long. And, we bring that gusto and energy, which fuels our success. And then we have kids, and all of a sudden there's dirty laundry on the floor, and the report that we meant to proofread, we're not going to get to until tomorrow morning. There's a sense that we don't have the control that what we once did. And that's 100% true. But at the phase of your life when you have kids, in a professional sense, you're not always being evaluated by, did you work until 11 p.m. and is, everything totally ticked and tied. You're being evaluated more as you reach that maturation point in your career by, do you have good judgment? Are you a good collaborator with colleagues? So I also encourage the people I'm working with to think about, try applying a new set of expectations and standards, right? Things can be messy and chaotic, but that doesn't mean you're failing. You've got to think about having a new set of goalposts.
So, can we kind of continue on that line of the expectations and standards, especially for a new parent? So, the first word that comes to mind from the parents I've spoken with here through Curious Neuron is their sense of identity. So, they become a new parent and they're questioning, who am I? Do I still want this career? But I worked so hard at it. I need to go back. Who am I back at work? In general. But I think that what you just said, also the expectations has to come back into the conversation with that piece. You walk us through in your book in terms of like going back and certain conversations we should have. So what would you suggest for a parent who's about to go back to work and still struggling with their identity? Where do they begin the
Yeah,
work or the conversations?
I'm so excited to talk about this, and I'm so glad you asked this question. So if this is you, I want you to try and find 45 minutes to yourself. And I know for working parents, easier said than done.
Mm-hmm.
And I want you to grab a piece of paper, or you can do this with another person if you want. And I want you to think about what your professional brand is and also your
Mm-hmm.
parenting brand. And by brand, that's kind of a weird word to apply to a human being, right? Because we think of brand as being like a consumer product or a
Mm-hmm.
brand of car or something. But a brand is just the qualities and characteristics that are authentic to you, that are how you are known, how you wish to be known, and that are kind of your leading positive and impactful qualities. So when I say, tell me about Cindy to somebody who, knows you well, but I'm talking to them without you present.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about Cindy. What they respond, those first two sentences, that's like your brand. It's how
Right.
you're known, the good
Yeah.
qualities. And it really is important to know what your professional brand is and who you are at your professional best, and to define that. And to define that by thinking about 5 to 7 phrases or adjectives that capture it. And then also define who you are on the parenting side, what your parenting brand is. So those two things might be very different. They might be very similar. Maybe as a professional, you're strategic and creative and analytical and a great collaborator. And maybe as a parent, you're strict or
Mm-hmm.
funny or read a ton to your kids. There's all different things. When you know what those things are, when you really reflect, it is so empowering.
Mm.
Because if you can pivot back to work after parental leave or go into a really intense work stretch and say to yourself, I don't have control over everything, right? And I'm in a really pressured period, but I am going to show up and be who I authentically am as an analytical, creative, collaborative professional.
Mm.
And when I drive home, when I commute home and my, key goes into the lock and I open the door and the kids are in there, or I pick them up at daycare and I pick them up, I'm immediately going to be the warm, funny,
Mm.
reads lots of books parent that they expect. And allowing yourself to do that allows you to feel successful,
Mm.
but anchored in your own genuine identity.
Mm. I just thinking about that activity makes me feel like empowered, right? Like you're putting words to it, you're seeing it in front of you, and it makes me think of some of the parents inside our membership, the Reflective Parent Club. That the first thing we do is talk about values, and we have them do an activity where they, have to come up with what their core values are, and when they see that, they're like, "Oh yeah, that is me," and then they feel empowered in that moment of like seeing it on the paper. So I can get that now you're seeing who you are in those two positions, right? Like those two brands, which makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it also
Yeah.
lets you drop the bar a little bit for yourself. I
Sure.
mean,
Yeah.
to be honest, last night was maybe not my best parenting night. It was a little bit late. I hadn't cooked dinner. One kid needed help with homework, and of course, I couldn't answer the question
Right.
because fifth grade math is beyond me, and whatever. It was just I
Same.
wasn't
Yeah.
feeling at my best.
Yeah.
But I could snap back to my brand and say, you know what, this is not like somebody else's image of perfection,
Mm.
but I'm being the parent who I am. I'm cracking jokes. I'm being available
Right.
to my child.
Yeah.
I'm here. I'm
Mm-hmm.
listening. I'm doing these things that are important to me, whether or not there's a perfect roast chicken on the table at 6:30 p.m. You know,
Mm.
or
Right.
a takeout pizza,
Yeah.
at 8:30.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
So that kind of makes me think of something that maybe some parents will end up doing, or consciously or unconsciously shoulds. What if that list ends up having some, I should be the parent that's present. I should be the parent that,
Yeah.
whatever it is. And I'm not that, but maybe I'll get there. And so you see that list of things you should be, and then that adds pressure. Does that ever happen when somebody makes that list?
Yeah, yeah. So it's going to sound like I'm cursing, and I promise I'm not.
No,
But
you're
brace
allowed to
yourself.
anyways.
Um, as working parents, we're shooting all over ourselves,
Right. But we
right?
are though.
It's
Right. Yes.
oppressive. It's
Yeah.
it's like carrying this heavy weight on us.
Mm-hmm.
Usually, when you hear the word "should" in your own mind or from somebody else, what that is a reflection or an image of success, professional, personal, whatever, that somebody has picked up elsewhere and is applying to themselves. So I should cook dinner every night because other people in my WhatsApp group tell me
Mm-hmm.
that they do it.
Mm-hmm.
I should be able to make vice president by age 37 because, that's what I've seen somebody else at the company do,
Right.
whatever. Those shoulds are really important to put into perspective and to realize that if you're hearing the word should, stop and challenge and say, where's that coming from?
Mm.
Because it's not coming usually from inside ourselves. It's not necessarily something that we find important, that we value, that we think is achievable. It's something that we've picked up through this sort of observations and, looking at other people's Instagram reels
Mm-hmm.
and all that kind of stuff.
Or
When you can try and park the shoulds, then it gets back to what you
mm,
yourself want to do.
right. And I think also you talk about these templates that we have, right? So I'm assuming some of these shoulds come from you mentioned the roast, right? Like I should have a roast on the table because I was raised by, I not that's not my experience, but a stay-at-home parent that had roasts on the table every day. And so every dinner without a roast is a
Yeah.
failure to me, right? Like are
Yeah.
there some of those that come out too?
Yeah, so
Mm.
a lot of our thinking about working parenthood is really influenced by what we've picked up, to your point, over the course of our whole lives. So what we saw in our family of origins, what we saw in our, professional training or part of our education or from early, career mentors. And I call that your template. Your working parent template is these little bits and pieces of should that you've internalized that gives you this sort of really powerful vision or view of what working parenthood is, should be, is supposed to be. The challenge, and particularly for the generation of parents who's actively parenting right now, who has children 0 to 18, is that most of us grew up or started our careers in actually a very different time. So I often ask people, they'll say, well, my dad worked really, really hard, but was always home for dinner. I should be home for dinner too. And I say, did your dad carry an iPhone or a smartphone? And even for people who are pretty young, right? Like prior to 2007, we weren't carrying those things. And so the world was a different place. We've evolved, the 24/7 pressures, the intensity of our economic climate, what we expect of ourselves, dual career couples being more and more common since maybe we were kids or our parents were kids. All of those things have changed, and nobody has put in structural supports or given us a new way of thinking about working parenthood. So we're holding ourselves to account for the shoulds of like 40 years ago or 20 years ago, as opposed to saying, here's the lane that we're swimming in today. And that's what needs to drive our expectations and our strategies, not what we saw mom do or dad do or what our first boss told us.
Mm. And, maybe that addresses also a lot of the pressure that parents feel. Was it with you that we were talking about that article that came out about stressed parents? There was somebody in the van ride, anyways, in Abu Dhabi. I don't know if it was you or Jessica Leahy, but there was a conversation that we had. There was an article that came out last year, the year before. Parents are very stressed because I think that we're placing a lot of pressure on ourselves. It comes back to maybe the beginning of a conversation where we should have everything balanced. And I think that like work-life balance for many parents I speak with is also perfection across the board, right? And which is not, it's an unrealistic expectation that we place on ourselves. So if a parent is listening to this and saying, okay, this is great, but I have a lot of pressure. I have a very, a job that requires my attention. Many parents here in this community are clinicians or even, run their own company. And so there's a lot of pressure around that. And so there's just pressure and stress, and I don't even know where to begin, right? Like I could address all the shoulds, but I can't stop parenting. There's 3 kids at home and I can't stop the work that I'm doing. People are depending on me. Is there advice? Do you have advice for those parents that don't even know where to begin now in terms of like bringing that level of stress down?
Yeah, I have a couple of hacks that I think are really powerful for this. One is to keep what I call an already done list. So I'm not a psychologist, but there's a psychological phenomenon called the Zeigarnik effect. And basically we forget completed tasks and we remember and have top of mind our uncompleted tasks.
Right. Yes.
And that makes sense. It's kind of your mind's way of like clearing things out. What that means is that we are constantly focused on our overwhelming to-do list, and it is top of mind for us, and we forget all the awesome stuff we've done.
It's true.
So as a working parent, it can be really motivating, and it can take some of that pressure and that stress down. If you just keep like, on your iPhone, I do it on my phone so I can access it anytime, but a list of, I snuggled with my toddler yesterday. I had a really good meeting with somebody who it's really hard to have a good meeting with. And we all know some of those people. I finished the report early. I mentored somebody. I made some freeze ahead meals at home for the weekend. What small stuff, doesn't have to be big. And then when you say, oh my gosh, there's so much going on. It's so daunting. I have to be perfect. You pull out that list and all of a sudden you feel your superpowers, right? You realize how productive and committed and successful you actually are. And then you can anchor some of your thinking back in that versus in overwhelm, which is one of the dominant. Guilt and overwhelm are the two sort of like dominant working parent emotions.
Yeah.
Another thing that's really, really important and has totally goes out the window for most working parents is any period of rest, recovery, or downtime.
Mm.
So I usually hear people say, like, well, I've got so much going on at home and at work, I don't have time for me time
Mm-hmm.
or self-care or restorative time.
Right.
Think about that like as if you're an athlete. If we said we want you to get to the Olympics and as a runner, and the way that we're going to do that is we're going to have you run 18 hours a day with no rest, no recovery, no nutrition, no injury prevention. You're just going to run the entire time. That's the way to get to the Olympics. You would say that's ridiculous. You're going to
Mm-hmm.
get injured. You're going to have overuse. You're going to be exhausted. You won't perform well. Yeah, exactly. So even if it's in very small bites, and so many of my clients are so busy, and I honor that, but I try and really sort of nudge them, and I say, try and spend 15 minutes a day doing something that you find restorative, not just relaxing, but actually restorative. So take a walk, call a friend, engage in a spiritual practice, get some exercise. And it doesn't have to be an hour-long class. It
Mm-hmm.
can just be the 5-minute Peloton,
Right.
whatever,
Yeah.
because that will keep you, again, feeling more energetic and feeling more capable.
Mm. This is aligned very well with what one of our guests in a previous episode said, where she was a palliative care physician in New York, actually. And she spoke about rest and restoration and how she had this analogy of a bathtub, right? The rest is when you plug it, you don't let the water drain, and you're just kind of sitting with the energy that's left, versus refilling the tub with fresh water is restoring your energy. And they need to do that in the work that they do, because then they can't keep up with the amount of emotional burden and struggles that come with the work that they do. And so, as parents, that analogy that you gave in terms of the athlete, hearing that out loud, you're like, well, that would be ridiculous. Why would an athlete do that? But then we hear about these high rates of burnout, and again, these levels of stress in parents that are through the roof, and it makes a lot of sense. So many parents that I speak with will tell me, I get a lot of guilt. I will sit down, I'm tired, I sit down, and I have guilt that I'm actually resting, that I'm doing nothing. Where do we begin with that? Sort of, that's a mindset that we have, right? Some of our parents maybe have played a small role in that, being productive, but we are in this sort of society, and I think there's a shift. But I think that we're stuck in this, like, productivity is a good thing. How do
Yeah.
we undo that thinking?
Yeah. So to undo that thinking, I think it's really helpful to think about how other people see us. And I know
Hmm.
that sounds like I'm
Hmm.
just adding more pressure here, but if I or you are like frantically busy all the time, constantly working, constantly on our feet, like to-do list, cranking, which feels productive and good to us. Like, do you or I really want to have our kids, when they grow up and they're adults, say, gosh, my mom was just so awesome. She was frenetic and frantic and worked constantly and never rested and never had time for anything and talked really fast. And that's why she was awesome. Probably not, right? We want to model for our colleagues and for our children being able to go into high gear and then being able to go into a different gear and being able to adjust and adapt, and modeling really prudent self-care is just as important in parenting as sort of getting it all done, if not more so. And another thing that I sometimes challenge people on is, there's actually, and I find this kind of mind-blowing myself, there's only one person in the entire world, there's only one person of the 8 billion people who can do your particular job and also be the parent you are to your particular children. And if you're not taking care of that solo player, then the whole picture that you're managing toward begins to fray at the edges.
Right.
So
It's
you've
true.
got to think about yourself.
Yeah. It's so important. And I think that self-care, that idea that there's no time. I think parents, we have to rethink that, and it could be a moment. You mentioned the 5 minutes, right, of working out or doing some exercise. The parents that I've spoken with as well, I talk about moments. I don't like saying like do an hour, take an hour out of your day. I like saying find a moment of rest, a moment of self care. Your breakfast might be your moment of self care, right? Like maybe you're gonna boil the eggs that you wanted, and you're like, okay, like I have a good breakfast, and it's gonna give me the energy that I want. That could be a moment, and so finding moments makes it seem less it makes it seem more achievable, I think, if we look at it that way.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, let's take a pause. So many parents that I speak with are stuck in this consuming content and learning all the time. And so I think that we forget that there's a really big part of learning where we pause. We have to let those neurons kind of build and multiply and take in what we are learning. And so let's just take a moment. There's something that Daisy spoke about that really resonated with me personally. I'm curious to know what resonated with you. You can always email me at info@curiousneuron.com. But for me, it was really taking the time to describe ourselves. So she talked about it as personal brand, because it's very easy to say that we want to be everything. And I think we do get stuck in that as well, where we want to be the perfect parent and we want to be the perfect person at work. But what does that mean to us, right? Like, how would we describe ourselves? And so we're going to be diving into that. If you are already part, like many of you are part of the Reflective Parenting Club, the Reflective Parent Club, we're going to be talking about that this Tuesday. So what are we? So it's going to be on June 10th. So we're going to talk about that. Every single Tuesday, we meet for 1 hour. And what I want to do is use the podcast as a space for us to use or dive deeper using the content and the tools that this expert has given us. We're going to reflect on that. We're going to take a moment to pause. We've been doing that in different ways, but it's the first time now that I'm going to start linking it to what we're learning on the podcast. And so there's a direct link. And so if you're enjoying the podcast and you don't take the time to really let it sink in, this is a great way and opportunity for you to do that. And so this Tuesday, we're going to be talking about or defining ourselves. What does that look like for us? And we're going to be doing some of the activities, the reflection activities that Daisy spoke about. So we're going to reflect about this, including, and I'm looking to my right because I'm looking at my notes. I told you I listened to this episode twice. It was just so good. But we're going to really take the time to talk about what restorative activities we do during the week and be mindful of the fact that we are, or maybe we're not doing that enough. Also, you can do this yourself, by the way. You can do this on your own if you want to. But if you're really curious to know and figure out, who you are and how do you define yourself, I have an activity that I thought of that we're going to be working on inside the Reflective Parent Club. So I'm really excited to do that. But you can do the same. Make sure that when you're listening to this episode, you take a moment to pause, look at what you wrote in your notebook, and see what applies to your life and what changes you can make or what reflections. And this in particular, as Daisy said, if you're not sure what your brand is, ask your partner, ask your kids, ask your parents or your in-laws how they see you as a parent, or your best friend. Maybe you don't want to ask your parents or your in-laws. And then when it comes to work, ask one or two of your most trusted colleagues or your supervisor or somebody that you trust. It needs to come from somebody that you care for and trust, that you would respect what they say to you, because maybe you won't like what they're saying 100%, and that's okay. You want to be able to hear them. But that will help you. And maybe it's not aligned with what you want to become. And so there's a lot of work that you can do around this. Take this episode, not just to kind of listen to and move to the next one. Pause with this episode this week. Use it to reflect. Listen to it on your walks or while you're working out, and then come back to it, and listen to certain parts. Mark the times, but really take this to dive in. If you want to join us inside the Reflective Parent Club, you can click the link in the show notes. You get 7 days for free. So if this episode really resonated with you, join us this Tuesday and join us inside the club. We're going to be having conversations around the content in this podcast episode. Come see what the community is all about. We're from all around the world, from Australia and Canada and the US and Asia and the UK and Portugal. you name it. There are so many people that are from different parts of the world. And so we bring in a lot of different perspectives. And what's most important is that they're there to listen to you and support you. And that's what makes us feel seen and not alone. All right, let's continue with my conversation with Daisy. And on the other side, I'll share the science with you so that you have this article that you can use to maybe talk to your boss or your colleagues about. Maybe there are changes that need to be made in the workplace for you. So I'll let you listen to the rest of the conversation. That I'm curious to know about. I'm thinking now of the parent at the workplace. Again, maybe they have a certain job where there's no room to be less than what you were before kids. And there's a certain standard or a pressure that you need to keep up regardless of having kids. Where do we start, with that conversation with our team, with maybe the manager of our team or whatever it is? um because I know that some parents that I've spoken with are afraid to have the conversation because they don't want to look like they can't keep up, and they're afraid to lose their job from that.
Yeah. Oftentimes when people say I'm worried about my job, I think I'm falling down on the job, I'm not doing well, etc. I challenge people a little bit, and I'll just ask, have you gotten that feedback, right? Have people
Mm-hmm.
told you, hey, you're falling down? How was your last performance review?
Right.
What did your numbers look like last quarter if you have a sales quota, for
Mm-hmm.
example? What and really, I've never had, honestly, that I can think of, anybody say, oh, yeah, I've been given that feedback.
Mm.
Usually people say, oh, no, my numbers are fine. It's just that I feel like I'm about to get fired.
So it's a story that we're telling ourselves without the facts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, one thing that can be really helpful is to look objectively, or to have an objective, like a partner. It doesn't have to be your life partner,
Mm-hmm.
but a friend or a colleague who you can play these things back to and say, I'm really freaked out about this. I feel
Mm-hmm.
like I'm not doing as well as I did before kids. If they can say, show me your performance review. What did you hear? What feedback are you getting from your boss? What does your client roster look like? What do your customer service feedback forms say? It, that can hold you kind of to a more objective reality,
Mm-hmm.
which usually is pretty good. I find if people are worried about I'm not doing as well as I did before, that's usually a sign to me, a pretty clear sign that they are working unbelievably hard to try and do as well as they did before. It's like, if you're worried about it, it's probably not
Mm-hmm.
actually something to worry
Right.
about,
Yeah.
because you're hyper vigilant about it and putting in extra effort.
Mm.
So I just think reframing that is really, really important.
Right. And I love that because I think most times when we're worried about something, there is a narrative or a story that we've told ourselves and we're stuck in that. Right. And so we place this either an unrealistic expectation on ourselves or some pressures without having that objective lens. And so it makes sense in the way that you said it to kind of look at it that way with facts.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've actually had clients come into coaching meetings with me and say that they were about to quit because
Wow.
they thought they had totally derailed,
Hmm.
and they were doing so poorly or whatever. And then I've been able to talk to their manager or colleagues, and the manager or colleagues are shocked.
Hmm.
They have no idea what you're going to quit. You think we're about to fire you? I mean,
Right.
it's just important to take the temperature down.
Hmm. I'm curious to know. There's also a sort of wave of parents that I've spoken with that are now I'm in my 40s and they're in their 40s and they're saying, you know what? I need to kind of step back a little bit and maybe decrease the hours a little bit or not place as much pressure on myself because I just want to focus on my family and
Yeah.
work. Have you seen this shift as well?
Yeah, I see it in different people at different times. Sometimes it's prompted by a career change or
Mm,
something going on in the family. And sometimes it's just the kids getting older or
right.
needing, more. Um, the thing about career is that it's sort of like having a backpack on,
Mm,
right? And you go through your life learning to put more things in the backpack and to carry that weight, and you put books and other stuff in there, whatever, and the backpack gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and you get really good at trudging forward with a heavy, heavy backpack.
mhm.
But nobody ever signals to us that it's actually in our control a lot of the time
Right.
to say, I'm going to stop,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to take the backpack off here for a second. I'm going to take some stuff out
Mm,
and I'm going to walk forward still. Like I'm going to continue with my profession, but maybe I'll cut back my hours or decide that I don't want to try and get to that next promotion or
mm-hmm.
level, or I'm at an earnings trajectory that, may not have me, on the road to, you know, the riches I once
Mm-hmm.
imagined, but is just fine.
Right.
And that feels to a lot of people like failure or over
Mm-hmm.
accommodation, but it's not.
Mm-hmm.
It's creating a deliberate decision about what is enough. And that's a superpower we all have.
This makes me think of, was it a thought activity or a reflection you had in your book about like thinking about 2 years or 5 years? I forget the number of years down the line. Would this apply to that maybe? If parents
Yeah.
are listening to this and kind of thinking about what that should look like for you?
I love that you brought that up, and it's an exercise I love doing with people. Yeah, spend some time on however you think, like on a good jog or on the
Mm-hmm.
commute home, whatever. Imagining a 5 to 10 year picture from now
Right. Five.
that's
Okay.
really happy, right? You're in a good place career wise, you're in a good place family wise. What does that look like? And
Mm,
you can sketch it. I've had people draw things in response to this or articulate it, whatever, however you think about it. But just imagine that super happy picture. And then bring it back to today and kind of challenge yourself a little bit and say, are the things that I'm prioritizing right now, are those seeds being planted towards the thing that I want to see grow? So if you, for example, 10 years from now are going to have teenage kids, but you want to have a great relationship with your teenage kids and be, the askable parent and really connected to your kids. But right now you're saying, I can't afford to slow down career wise, and you're
mm,
traveling 5 days a week. It's not that that's wrong at all. That's a choice that you can make.
right.
Absolutely. But it may or may not be pushing you towards and aggregating towards your happy picture.
Mm,
So think about what will, and maybe there's some tweaks that you can make in the here and now that don't feel overwhelming. Maybe you travel 3 days a week instead of five, and you prioritize always being home for family dinner on Wednesday.
mm.
Fine. But that can make you a really, really solid parent in the way you wish to be years from now.
I absolutely love this activity. And for those listening, if you are a member, your book will be the book of the month in May. And we're going to be using that as a reflection together as a group, because I do think that
Great.
it's so important for us to do that. And to, like you said, we're planting seeds, right? And we're saying, what can I do today to make sure that I get to that tomorrow and at 5 or 10 years? And I think it's important for us to think about that.
Yeah.
Mm,
It also lets us step back from things that aren't so important. So, talking about working parent overwhelm, I salute any parent who volunteers their time in any way and capacity, and the world
mm,
needs volunteers. But
mm.
if you're beating yourself up today because you didn't make it to that PTA meeting and you think
Right.
that doing
Yeah.
that is going to, okay, well, unless in your plus 10 years picture, you will only be happy if you're the president of the PTA, then don't beat yourself up about it. It's
Right.
okay.
Mm,
Maybe it's not the lever that you want to be pulling
mm.
in the here and now.
There's a comfort in hearing that. I love that. It's yeah, it's such a good activity. So now we've been talking about things that are in our control, right? What can we do as parents? But I think about things that feel like they're out of our control at work in terms of the workplace that we're working with. What are some changes you wish would happen at workplaces? I think of one of my friends. She works in human resources, and at the company she's working at a couple of years ago, they added, I think it was 3 to 5 extra sick days, and people were crying. People were crying at the number of extra paid days they had, especially the parents, because kids are sick all the time. And so it just shows how impactful some small changes are within a company. But this change took almost a year within this company, because there were many conversations that had to be had to see if this was possible. What are some changes you think should be, happening inside the workplaces?
Yeah, I love that change. And I think, using that extra day to sick child or to go to the school play. I mean, there's so
Right.
many different things that we have to do.
Exactly.
One thing that I would love to see happen and it is happening, and I want to see it happen more, is just people being more open about what they're going through and what working parenthood is like.
Mm-hmm.
Because when really smart, capable people become working parents and they're not sure how to handle it, when they feel like they're not doing their best, the immediate instinct is to isolate. Right?
Right.
I don't want to look like a doofus and go talk
Mm-hmm.
to other people and say, I don't know what I'm doing and I'm clueless and it's the first week back from parental leave and what do I do and blah, blah, blah. So they just go quiet and they withdraw and they kind of go inside themselves. I would love for senior people who have, positions of authority and visibility in organizations to just drop more in there about their own working parent lives.
Hmm.
And as soon as somebody says, I'm expecting, or I'm just back from leave, or, we're expanding our family, to have, 6 people in the hallway say, hey, I've been there. Let me know when you want to talk. Not a problem.
Yeah.
That's happening in some of these working parent employee resource groups and affinity networks very informally. And it's peer-to-peer stuff. But I hope that there's more top-down messaging about
Yeah.
that is okay. I actually had a really, really awesome experience on this. It was probably about a year ago, and I was outside my kids' school. It was a holiday concert that I was supposed to go to, and my kids were going to be performing. I was on the phone with one of my major corporate clients, a very senior person. And I was talking about, and it wasn't even explicitly about working parent stuff, it was sort of career stuff. And at some point I looked at my watch and I thought, oh no. And I said, I'm really sorry, but I need to hang up because I've got to get inside to, it's my kid's holiday
Right.
concert. And this very senior person, a financial services professional, went dead silent. And I thought, oh, I flubbed this one
Yeah.
up good, like
That's what
I'm
I would
never
thought.
working for this client
Yeah.
again. And then he said, why are you not already in there? He said, you are
Uh,
supposed to get the good seat so the kids can see you in the front row of the balcony and you wave at them. He was
mm,
like, stop this, get in there. And it hung up. And I give this gentleman such
yeah.
credit.
Mm,
But I think it's just those little things that will really change the culture that
mm-hmm.
then allow us to be the working parents we want.
Mm-hmm. And I can completely understand your thinking that this person's going to react that way, because I think most of us would think that, which is why
Yeah.
probably some of us would not even want to tell them. Like, we probably say, like, I can't lose this client, and so I'm going to make sure I finish with this client before I go back in. We tell ourselves this rather than just saying, like, I need to go. This is the boundary I have right now. I need to go. We forget.
Yeah.
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 Yeah,
Such a good story.
working parenthood can sometimes be a little bit of like a secret handshake too. So, you know how people talk about the weather or sports?
Yeah.
And I can know nothing about you and you know nothing about me, but all of a sudden we're best friends because we're talking about basketball or something.
Right. Yeah.
It can be the same for working parents, and we shouldn't discount that. Like, I may not know anything at all, but I see on your desk you have pictures of kids, and I can
Mm,
say, how old are they now? And all of a
mm-hmm.
sudden we're bonded.
Right.
And I think that needs to happen more too.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's achievable. I think we can do that. We just have to be more intentional in terms of doing that, and not being too afraid as well, because I think some of us might be afraid of speaking up about that. So I think that's good advice. What's happening? I'm in Canada, and I know that we have I only learned this around the pandemic. I had no idea that you didn't have the same parental leave as we do here.
No.
Is that changing? Is there a
No.
shift? No. Would that be
No.
another one you think is
Yeah.
important?
Yes and no. So
Hmm.
the United States has a more limited national policy on parental leave. We have what's called FMLA, which entitles most but not all people who have children to take leave, but only if their employers are of a certain size. And there's other specific restrictions around it. And that leave is not guaranteed to be paid. It's an unpaid thing. What I am seeing, so I haven't heard anything
Hmm.
really meaningful or that I'm aware of. And I should say I'm not a policy expert. I'm a
Right.
executive coach, but
Hmm.
I'm not aware of anything on that front. What I do see is a lot of organizations trying to just within their organization improve leave policy, improve flexibility policies,
Right. That's another one.
offer backup care, do all sorts of things that they have control over in their organization. So there is a lot
Okay.
that's good that's on the move.
Hmm.
And then the sponsoring of these working parent networks. So there's some peer to peer learning. I think those policies and programs are really powerful, but I think it's the practices. So it's like a three-legged stool, like
Mm,
policy, program, and then practice. But practice is the little stuff that we do day to day. It's
mm,
when I, as a boss, say to you, hey, I trust you to get your work done, whether
right.
you're here or whether you're, on your way to daycare
Right.
and
Or
are
at
going to log
home.
on later tonight.
Yeah.
That's not a policy measure, but it's a
Mm,
practice that can really shape and influence
mm,
the doability of working parenthood. And I think that's where we can get the most lift quickly.
right. I want to be mindful of your time, but I want to kind of like summarize a bit of what we've been talking about for parents. And maybe the way that we can do this is I'm actually curious. So not intentionally, but you initially went out to write this book because it didn't exist. After it did, and you had done your research and you wrote the book, how did that shape you? Like, what sort of parts of what you learned kind of changed what you were doing as a working parent that maybe other parents can follow?
Yeah. So one thing I started doing is just asking other people for advice constantly. So
Right.
the
Yeah.
book, the research that I did for the book was interviews with hundreds of working parents in all different fields and family structures and phases of parenting and functions and across the country and actually around the world. I talked to
Mm,
people in different countries. And I just said, what works? And in every single one of those conversations, I came away thinking, why didn't I know that one little nugget
mm,
before? That would have been so useful. So it drives my family insane because I can be, on an airplane next to somebody and I'm like, hey, you a working parent? Great. Well, how do you do when you travel? How do you stay in touch with your family? And they're like,
right.
don't you have an off switch ever on this stuff?
No.
And the answer is no, I
Right.
don't. I don't, because the
Mm,
more we connect, the more a sense of community we have, and the
mhm,
more these tools move from one to the other, and they're
mm.
all valuable.
That's great advice, and it's something that we can do. I think it makes it attainable again, and that's important. You know, everything that we spoke about comes back down to the mission that we have here at Curious Neuron, which is parental well-being and making sure that parents, nurture their well-being, because when we are not well, it trickles down to our kids, and we do that specifically through emotion regulation. But what you just spoke about in terms of managing that biggest stressor, that work life balance that everybody talks about, you've made it seem achievable in a way that we can just take small steps. So I hope somebody can listen to this. And I think it's one of these conversations that you're going to have to listen to more than once and then break it down into the different activities that you've spoken about today. Daisy, thank you for sharing the work that you did. And thank you for the book. I will put the book, the link in the show notes for Canada and the US. Is there anywhere else that we can reach out or learn more from you and your work?
Yeah, I do a lot of posting on LinkedIn. You can follow me
Okay.
there.
Hmm.
And you can always just drop me a line direct, Daisy Dowling at workparent.com, or our corporate address is hello at workparent.com. Easy to remember. And we're always happy to connect with parents and with organizations who are looking to raise the game on this topic.
I absolutely love it. I will put all those links in the show notes. Thank you so much, Daisy.
Thanks for having me.
All right. I hope you enjoyed this episode and this conversation with Daisy as much as I did. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast if you'd like to hear more of these conversations with my insights as a neuroscientist and mom of three. But now let's talk about the study that I mentioned at the beginning of this episode. So let me just draw up my notes here. So 65% of working parents reported experiencing burnout in this study. So it was a recent study by Golick in 2025, and they found that many working parents experience burnout, which is a deep exhaustion from juggling work and parenting, which can lead to higher stress, obviously, and higher levels of depression, anxiety as well. And so the research showed that parents are especially at risk if they have very little support, a very high demanding job, or young children at home. So these are the three that really add to the stress and the burnout. But burnout not only affects parents' well being, but can also make it harder to connect positively with your kids. So a parent who's really burnt out, and by the way, burnout is not just the stress, there's a physical and emotional component to that. And so when you are going through a burnout, it makes it much harder for you to show up for your kids because they are looking for the emotional connection from you. But if you think of it as a battery, you're drained. You're at the bottom and you cannot show up in the way that they need. And so you are not noticing, but most probably not being responsive to their needs or emotional needs. You're probably not showing up as warm to their needs and their emotional needs. You're probably seeing their behavior more as acting out rather than them communicating something to you. And there's a chance that you're just not being able to respond to them in the way that you want to. And so this is not, I'm not saying this so that you listen to this and feel bad. I want you to really see this and hear this in a way that I want you to take care of yourself. If you are noticing signs of burnout, and you can Google signs of burnout, there's a disconnect from what you're doing at work. And so if you used to enjoy something and now you don't anymore, there's a constant physical exhaustion that just no amount of sleep will help. There's an aspect, a physiological aspect that is not allowing you to create the energy like you used to. And so it's not just about feeling tired, it's a lot more than that. But most importantly, that emotional disconnect from your colleagues, from work, from friends. You don't even want to see them anymore. You don't even have the energy to do that. You might be going through burnout. And so this study was reminding all of us that, again, let me just pull up my notes, but that there's an emotional and a physical and a mental exhaustion that makes you or leads to parents disconnecting from their kids and feeling a lot less motivated. And so there's another really important part of this study. So parents who had anxiety or depression or ADHD or past trauma were even more likely to experience burnout. And so, again, if you're not even sure if you're experiencing burnout, and there's a high percentage of parents that we saw in this study based in the US, 65% parents. I have a feeling it's not that far away here in Canada. If you have one of these, then there's an even higher chance of you perhaps experiencing burnout. And if you have, the study found that if you have a child with anxiety, ADHD, or one that has, any mental health issues, then again, this increases your chance of parental burnout. I don't think that we should be ignoring these. I think that we should be aware of it. I think that we should be sharing this episode with our friends who we think might be experiencing burnout, colleagues who have a child who has ADHD or is neurodiverse. They might have a higher chance of experiencing burnout. And so if you're seeing somebody at work who's not performing the same way that they used to, they don't seem motivated. They're not even hanging out in the lunchroom anymore. They're not really connecting with you anymore. Again, similarly to our kids, where we see it as a behavioral thing, here we might say, like, what's their problem? Rather than like, what happened to you? How can I help you? What's going on? And so at the workplace, we also need to be very mindful about this. And maybe you want to share this episode with your team. Maybe you want to share this episode with your boss or your manager. This is a really important episode for all working parents. Okay, so there was more from this study. Having two or more children also increased the chances of burnout. Mothers were twice as likely of experiencing burnout, and the list goes on. So I just want us to remember that there are lots of factors that could increase our chances. I'm sure that most of you listening to this could check off at least one of the boxes that I just described. And this study looked at a large number of parents, and this is what they found. These were the factors that increase the chances of burnout for parents. We get a lot of those. And if you're a teacher, if you work in healthcare, I know lawyers who, have a lot of heavy workload. It isn't easy. So here's a quick check-in that I'd love for you to ask yourself this week. Do I feel emotionally drained, hopeless, or question whether I can keep going as a working parent? This is my reflection to you. Answer it honestly. Because if the answer is that you do feel drained, that you do feel hopeless, and you keep questioning whether you could go on like this, don't look at it as this is the rest of my life. Look at it as, where do I begin the work? What do I need to cut back on? Where do I need to ask for support? There are many ways that you can approach this. And if you need some support, come join us inside the Reflective Parent Club. These are the kinds of things that we reflect on. And it's really important for you to reflect on this as well. And again, just to kind of highlight again that this study found so many factors that correlate with our increased risk of burnout. They also found that parents who are experiencing burnout are more likely to physically harm their child 4 times more likely, in fact. And they tend to scream and criticize and curse at their child 2 to 4 times more likely. And this is what we were seeing during the pandemic as well, where the parent who was burnt out and always with their kids and didn't have an outlet was increasing chances of harm to the child and verbal abuse and so on and neglect. And so I need you to hear this. Take a moment to step back this week and look at what your work life looks like. You're not going to find the perfect balance, but what can that balance for you look like in a way that supports and nurtures your well being? I hope that this episode helped you or raised some awareness to some things that you might be going through. Make sure that you subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Instagram or on Facebook or on YouTube, wherever you are listening to or watching this. And if you'd like some support and you're like, you know what, it's about time I do something for myself, take the 1 hour a week to come and reflect with us and do these kinds of reflections and do this kind of work that builds your self awareness and helps you learn emotion regulation skills that are going to manage stress much better. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you next Monday. Bye.